Roland Quill was on his feet before the attorney had turned the page, his stool knocked flat behind him, his hand flat on the desk as though he could press the words back into it. "You cannot mean it," he said. "You cannot mean to read that as it stands." Mr. Ambrose Teague, attorney of Frome, set the will down upon the blotter and folded his hands over it, and looked at the standing man with the weary courtesy of one who had spent 30 years watching families discover what their dead had truly thought of them. "It stands as it is written, Miss Quill," he said. "Signed by your cousin's own hand, witnessed twice, and proved. You may shout the roof off this office and it will read the same when you are done." The young woman in the corner did not move at all. Her name was Marianne Ashcombe. She was 23, and she had walked 4 miles that morning in a borrowed bonnet to hear what small kindness a dead man had thought to leave her, expecting a keepsake, a workbox, perhaps a ring. Before 2 winters had gone by, the mill owners of 3 Valleys, the men who had laughed at her name across their dinner tables, would send their wives in carriages to her door to beg a single yard of what came off her looms, and would pay in gold to be refused. Not one soul in that room could have believed it. She believed it least of all. Mr. Teague drew the paper back toward himself and read the clause again, slowly, because the room had gone stiff and would not take it in at the first telling. "To Miss Marianne Ashcombe, daughter of my late and dearest friend Captain Edmund Ashcombe, I give and bequeath my freehold at Nunheithe, being the silk mill there standing upon the river, with the throwing frames, the winding engine, the water wheel and its gear, the dye house and the drying loft, together with all silk in stock, whether raw, thrown, or woven, and my pattern book, to have and to hold to her and to her heirs forever, that she may finish the work I had not years enough to finish myself. And to my cousin Roland Quill I leave the sum of £30, and my forgiveness, which he will need more than the money." The attorney had the decency to keep his eyes on the page while he read the last of it. Roland Quill looked as though someone had emptied a cold jug down the back of his coat. £30, he said. £30, and the mill to a girl who has never thrown a thread in her life. "She is Captain Ashcombe's daughter," said the third person in the room, a spare gray clergyman named Mr. Dunstan. From the window seat, gently, Josiah loved her father like a brother. "There is nothing strange in it." "There is everything strange in it," said Roland. "That mill is Quill blood. My grandfather raised the wheel. My father greased the gear. And it goes to a stranger's orphan in a made-over gown. It goes where the freeholder chose to send it," said Mr. Teague, without heat. "The mill was your cousin Josiah's to give. Bought clear, held clear, willed clear. I am sorry it grieves you. I am not paid to make wills that please the living." Marianne had not yet said one word. She sat with her hands folded in her lap over the borrowed reticule, and she looked at the grain of the floorboards, and she thought, with a strange still calm that surprised her even as she felt it, that she had never in her life owned anything that could not be carried in 2 hands, and now she owned a building on a river, and she did not know whether to weep or laugh, and so she did neither. Her aunt, Mrs. Prudence Ashcombe, the widow of an uncle long dead, who had housed Marianne these 6 years for the price of her being useful and quiet, sat beside her in the good chair and pressed her lips into a line. "Marianne," she said, in the voice she kept for company, "you will decline it, of course. A young woman cannot own a manufactory. It is not to be thought of. It would be a spectacle." Mr. Teague coughed into his hand. "Madam," he said, "with respect, the property is willed to Miss Ashcombe outright and without condition. She may decline it if she pleases. She may also keep it if she pleases. The law does not consult her aunt on the matter. And what is she to do with a ruin on a dead river? Said Roland Quill, who had recovered enough to turn cruel. Have you seen it, girl? Have you seen what you have been left? The wheel has not turned in 4 years. The loft leaks, the frames are seized with rust, and the mice have eaten the harness. My cousin let it die around his ears because he was too proud to sell it and too old to work it. You have been left a debt and a drought and a name that every clothier from here to Bradford will laugh at. Take my advice and take my 30 pounds instead, and let me buy the wreck off you for what the timber is worth. Marianne lifted her eyes then, for the first time, and looked at him. Thank you, she said. It was all she said. But there was something in the way she said it, level and unhurried and entirely without gratitude, that made Roland Quill sit down again without quite knowing why he had. Mr. Teague looked at her over his spectacles with the first flicker of interest he had shown all morning. Would you like to see it, Miss Ashcombe? He said. The property, before you decide. I would, she said. I think I had better. You will do no such thing, said her aunt. You will come home, and we will write a proper letter declining, and we will hear no more of Silk Mills. It is settled. It is not settled, said Marianne quite quietly, and it was the first time in 6 years that anyone in that family had heard her say the word not to her aunt, and Mrs. Ashcombe drew back as though the cushion beneath her had spoken. I should like to see it, Marianne said again to the attorney, and Mr. Teague inclined his head and reached for his hat. The mill at Nunheath stood a mile below the village where the road forsook the top of the down and dropped through beech woods to the water, and Marianne heard it before she saw it, which is to say she heard the river, for the mill itself made no sound at all. It was a long stone building of 3 floors under a steep tiled roof, gone green along the north pitch, with a row of small square windows down each floor, many of them broken and stuffed with rag or boarded over, and at its flank the great wheel hung motionless and black in its race, half the buckets rotted away, weeds streaming from the axle where the water still slid uselessly past. Ivy had got into the mortar of the gable. A young ash tree had rooted itself in the gutter, and stood there in leaf, absurd and green, 20 feet up. The gate to the yard hung by one hinge, and beyond it the cobbles were furred with moss, and a barrow lay on its side where someone had dropped it 4 years before, and no one had thought to right it since. Mr. Teague stood in the gateway and did not go in. I will wait here, he said, if it is all the same. My knees do not care for stairs, and the loft, I am told, is not to be trusted. He gave her a great iron key, cold and heavy as a poker, and a candle lantern he had thought to bring. And he said, Take your time, Miss Ashcombe. It is yours to look at as long as you like. And she crossed the mossed cobbles alone and put the key to the door. It turned hard, and then it turned, and the door swung inward on a smell she would remember all her life, the smell of cold stone and old oil and river damp, and under all of it, faint and sweet and strange, the smell of silk, which is a smell like nothing else, like warm dust and clean animal and something almost of honey, sunk into the very timbers of the place by 40 years of thread passing through. She stood in the doorway and let her eyes come round to the dark. The ground floor was one long room, and down the middle of it stood the throwing frames, 6 of them, tall as a man and twice as long. A forest of little upright spindles and reels and rollers all threaded through with a geometry she did not understand, every surface silvered with dust and hung with cobweb, and the iron of them freckled orange with rust. At the far end, the winding engine crouched under its own leather belts, gone slack and cracked, and above her the ceiling was a ceiling of beams and the underside of the floor above, and here and there a pale coin of daylight came down through a broken board. She walked the length of the room slowly, her candle throwing the shadows of the spindles across the walls in a moving thicket. And she put her bare hand on the cold iron of the nearest frame, and she felt, foolishly, that she had woken something, or ought to. Everything waited. That was the feeling she could not shake, then or after. The place did not feel dead. It felt asleep, and cross about it, like a dog turned out in the rain, and it seemed to her as she stood there, that if she were to find the trick of it, the wheel would remember how to turn, and the frames would remember how to spin, and the whole cold building would come up out of its 4 years of sulking and be what it had been. She had no earthly reason to think so. She had never seen silk thrown in her life. But she thought it, and having thought it, she found she could not simply hand the great key back to Mr. Teague and go home to her aunt and be useful and quiet for the rest of her days. If you have ever stood in a place that others had given up for dead, and felt, against all sense, that it was only waiting for the right hands, then you already know how this story ends, and you will want to see how she got there. So stay by the fire with us, and if a slow, true tale of a ruin brought back to life is the kind of thing that warms your evening, you might set a light in the window for us by subscribing, so the fire is always lit when you come back. Now, where were we? She was standing among the frames with her hand on the cold iron, and she could not put the key back. She climbed the ladder stair to the first floor, testing each rung, and found the winding room, where the raw silk had been unreeled from the skein and wound onto bobbins, and long racks stood empty along the wall, and a single bobbin still hung in its cradle with a thread of honey-colored silk trailing from it to the floor, as though the last hand to touch it had meant to come back in a moment and had never come back at all. She wound the loose thread onto her finger, gently, and it was cool and it did not break, though it was 4 years dusty, and that, more than the will, more than the key, more than her aunt's face, was the thing that decided her. 4 years, and it had not perished. It had only waited. She stood a long time in that gray winding room turning the thread on her finger, and she thought of her father, whom she had lost when she was 17. A naval surgeon who had come home from the wars with a chest gone bad and no money and a great many stories, and who had told her, near the end, when she sat up with him through his coughing nights, that the world was full of people waiting to be told they could not do a thing, and that the whole trick of a life was to decline the telling. She had thought it fine talk from a dying man who had done all his own daring young. She had not known then that she would ever be asked to make it her own. She knew now. She stood in the winding room with the thread on her finger, and she declined, quietly. In her own heart, every voice that had ever told her what a woman of her sort might and might not do, her aunt's chief among them, and it was as though a window she had not known was shut came open, and let in cold air, and it was the sweetest breath she had ever drawn. She went up again to the drying loft under the roof, where the light came gray and generous through a long row of dormers, and the floor was littered with the leaves the wind had brought in through the broken panes, and she stood among the empty drying frames and looked out through a clear pane down the river valley, the water bright below, the beech woods rising, a heron standing in the shallows below the dead wheel, and she thought that she had never in her life stood in a room that was her own, and that this one, ruinous and leaking and laughed at, was hers, and no one living could put her out of it. And she thought, standing at that clear pane, of all the reasons she ought to say no, and she counted them honestly, for she was not a fool and would not begin a great thing on a fancy. She had no money to speak of. She had no knowledge of the trade. She had no husband, no father, no brother, no man of any kind to stand for her in a world that did not let women stand for themselves, and she knew none better how a woman alone was spoken of, and how a woman alone in trade was spoken of worse, and how her aunt was right. In the narrow worldly way, her aunt was always right. That to do this was to step outside the safe, warm circle of what a respectable woman might do, and stand, exposed, in the cold, where the world could see her, and judge her, and, if she failed, laugh at her falling. All of that was true, and she stood there and let it all be true, and weighed it honestly against the one thing on the other side of the scale, which was that the place was hers, and that it was waiting, and that if she did not try, she would spend the rest of her life in her aunt's parlor, being useful and quiet and wondering, on the bad nights, what she might have made of a mill on a river if she had only had the courage, and she found, weighing the two, that a whole life of safe wondering was heavier to bear than any amount of cold and mockery and risk. And that decided her, there at the pane, though she had in truth decided already, downstairs, with a dusty thread wound on her finger, and was only now finding the reasons to match the choice her heart had made without her. She was still standing there when she heard the boots on the stair. She turned, expecting Mr. Teague come to hurry her, and found instead a man she did not know, a big man, 60 or near it, in a leather apron and a laborer's smock, with a great gray beard and eyebrows like frost on a hedge, and hands that looked as though they had been made out of the same oak as the frames below. He stopped when he saw her, and took off his hat and stood turning it in his hands, and his face was doing something complicated. "You'll be the young lady," he said. "Miss Ashcombe." "I am," she said. "And you are?" "Ephraim Sedge," he said. "I was foreman here, back when here was anything. 40 years, man and boy. I minded the frames for old Mr. Josiah and for his father before him. I heard in the village the mill was left away from the quills, and I could not credit it, and I came to see for myself, and beg your pardon for coming up your stair without a by your leave. But I have not been let in this door in 4 years, and I could not help my feet." He looked around the loft as a man looks at the face of someone he has grieved for. "It is a sorry sight," he said. "It was the finest throwing shop in the West when I was a young fellow. We threw organzine here that went to the ribbon weavers at Coventry and the mercers in London both, and there was not a mill in the county could match our thread for evenness. And then the war choked the trade, and the raw silk got dear, and the young ones went off to the wool mills and the cotton where the wages were, and Mr. Josiah got old. And one winter the wheel iced and cracked a bucket, and there was no money and no hands to mend it, and it just stopped. He never got it going again. It broke his heart, I think, though he'd not have said so." Marianne looked at this old man standing in her loft, with his hat in his hands and grief in his face, and she made, in that moment, the first of the many decisions that would remake her life, and she made it before she had thought about it at all. "Mr. Sedge," she said, "I do not know the first thing about silk. I do not know a spindle from a reel. I have 30 pounds coming to me, and a mill, I am told, is a ruin, and an aunt who wishes me to sell it for firewood. But I find I do not wish to sell it. I find I wish to make it turn again. And I cannot do it alone, for I would not know where to begin. Would you help me?" He looked at her for a long moment, and something moved in the frost-white brows, and he said, in a voice gone rough, "Miss Ashcombe, I have prayed 4 years to be asked that question. I did not think it would be a young lady in a borrowed bonnet that asked it. But yes. God help us both, yes, I will. They talked for an hour in that loft, the two of them, while the light went, and the old man told her things she did not yet understand and would come to understand. And she asked him questions a child might ask. What is a spindle? What is throwing? Why does the water turn it? And he answered every one without a flicker of scorn. For he had waited 4 years to be asked, and a man who has waited 4 years to talk of the thing he loves does not mind where he must begin. He told her that the mill had thrown silk when his own grandfather was a boy, that there had been a time when the ribbon looms of Coventry could not get enough of Nunheathy organzine, and the pack horses went up the London road in strings, that he had come to the mill at 11 years old to sweep beneath the frames, and had risen to foreman by the time he was 40, and had never in all that time thought to work anywhere else, for the mill was not to him a place of work, but a living thing that he had tended as a shepherd tends a flock, and that watching it die around Mr. Josiah in those last poor years had been the worst grief of his life. Worse, he said quietly, than burying his own wife, God forgive him, for his wife had died in the course of nature, and the mill had died of neglect, which was a harder thing to watch. And Marianne, listening, understood that she had not only inherited a building and a trade, but a man's whole heart, and that if she failed she would break it a second time, and she resolved, standing there, that she would not, though she had no earthly notion yet how she should keep the resolve. That was how it began. That was the whole of the beginning. An old foreman and a penniless girl standing in a leaking loft over a dead wheel, shaking hands on a thing that everyone who heard of it would call madness, and most of them did. When Marianne came down and told Mr. Teague that she meant to keep the mill and try to work it, the attorney looked at her for a long moment, and then, unexpectedly, he smiled. Your father, he said, once rowed a longboat into a battery that 3 admirals had called impossible, and carried it, and was made captain for it at 27. I met him but the once. You have his look about you just now. I will draw the papers. And when she came home and told her aunt, Mrs. Ashcombe put down her teacup with a click and said that Marianne had run mad, that she had shamed the family, that no respectable house in the parish would receive a young woman who kept a manufactory and consorted with greasy foremen, that she, Prudence Ashcombe, would not be answerable for it, and that Marianne might go and live in her ruin among the rats and see how she liked it. For she should not go on living under a respectable roof and disgracing it. It was said in temper, and it was meant to frighten her back into being quiet. But Marianne, who had been quiet 6 years, heard it as an offer of freedom, and she took her aunt at her word, and packed her small trunk that same night, and by the end of the week she was living in the 2 dry rooms at the end of the mill that had been the old counting house, with a cot borrowed from Ephraim Sedge's own cottage, and a fire in the grate and the sound of the river coming up through the floor. Her aunt did not come to the door to see her go, and sent no word after, and Marianne walked the 4 miles to the mill on the last morning carrying her own small trunk on her own shoulder, for there was no one to carry it for her, and she would not have asked if there had been, and she set it down in the bare cold counting house and looked round at the 4 damp walls that were now the whole of her estate, and she was, for a moment, very frightened, more frightened than she would let herself be again for a long while. For it is one thing to defy an aunt in the heat of a will reading, and quite another to stand alone in a cold ruin on a grey morning with a borrowed cot and £30 and no way back. And she stood there, and let the fright have her for exactly as long as it took the kettle to boil on the new-lit fire. And then she made her tea and drank it and put the fear away where it belonged, and went to find Ephraim Sedge, and began. Those first nights alone in the counting house were the strangest of her life. She had never slept a night entirely alone before, having gone from her father's house to her aunt's, and the mill at night was full of sounds, the river talking under the floor, the timbers ticking as the day's small warmth went out of them, the wind finding every broken pane and playing on the building as on a great rough flute, and once, on the third night, a soft, heavy tread overhead that stopped her heart until she went up with the lantern and found it was only an owl come in through a dormer to hunt the mice, and it looked at her with its round gold eyes and did not stir, and she decided that an owl was a good thing to have in a mill full of mice, and left it to its business. And it stayed, and she came in time to think of it as the mill's other tenant and to leave the dormer clear for it. She had brought almost nothing with her: a change of linen, her father's watch that did not go, a small worn Bible, her mother's wedding ring that she wore on a ribbon about her neck for it was too big for any finger, and a packet of her father's letters. And she set these few things about the bare counting house, and they made it, not homely, but hers. And she found that she did not miss her aunt's warm parlor, and its endless careful talk of who had called and who had not, and that she would rather be cold and free than warm and quiet, and this discovery more than any other told her she had chosen right. Word of it ran round the 3 valleys before her fire was well alight. The Ashcombe girl, the poor relation, the surgeon's orphan, gone to live alone in Josiah Quill's dead mill and set up as a silk throster, if you please, with no money and no husband and no notion of the trade, taking her orders from a broken-down old foreman. It was the best joke the clothiers' dinner tables had enjoyed in a 12-month. Mr. Barnabas Thorne, who owned the great new wool mill at the head of the valley and 300 hands in it, laughed until he had to set down his glass, and said that he gave her till Michaelmas, and offered to wager on it, and found no takers, for no one thought she would last so long. The one man who did not laugh was Roland Quill, and that was because Roland Quill had not given up. He came to the mill within the fortnight, in his good coat, all reason and regret, and stood in the yard and told her that he bore her no ill will, that it was not her doing but his cousin's folly, that a young lady of her breeding should not be living rough among the spindles, that he would give her not £30 now, but 60 in coin that very day, for a clean release of the property, and that she might go back to her aunt with a little fortune in her pocket and put the whole unhappy business behind her. It was kindly said, and it was not kindly meant, and Marianne knew the difference. "I thank you, Mr. Quill," she said, "but I mean to try, and if I fail, you shall have your chance to buy a wreck, and it will be worth less then than it is now, so you had better hope I fail quickly." He went away with his jaw tight, and she watched him go, and she understood, without anyone telling her, that she had made an enemy who would not shout at her as he had shouted at the attorney, but would wait and watch and set his foot on her neck the first moment she stumbled. She was right about that. She was right about it sooner than she knew. The trouble was that Roland Quill had been the one to keep his cousin's books these last poor years, out of what looked like family duty and was in fact something nearer to a spider keeping the accounts of a fly. And he knew, as Marianne did not, that the mill did not stand upon clean-held ground the whole way, that there was an old mortgage of £200 upon the water rights and the wheel race, taken out by Josiah in a bad year and never cleared, and that the mortgage was held by a Bristol money lender named Mr. Silas Grope, and that Roland Quill had, the very week of the funeral, quietly bought that mortgage off Mr. Grope for something under its face. He said nothing of this to Marianne. He meant to let her pour her heart and her £30 into the ruin, and grow the property's worth with her own 2 hands, and then, when it was worth having and not before, call in the mortgage she did not know existed, and take the whole improved estate for the price of a debt she could never pay. It was a patient, lawful, cold-blooded plan, and it very nearly worked. But that was to come. In the first weeks, Marianne knew nothing of mortgages, and would not have understood the danger if she had, and she gave herself instead to the thing in front of her, which was learning, from the ground up, a trade that had taken Ephraim Sedge 40 years to master. He was a patient teacher, and a hard one. He would not let her touch a frame the first fortnight. First, he said, "You learn what silk is, or you will never learn to throw it," and he sat her down on an upturned crate in the winding room and taught her the fibre itself, taught her that silk was the thread a small worm spins to wrap itself in, that a single cocoon paid out 1 thread near a mile long and finer than a hair, that this raw thread came to them in skeins from the merchants at Bristol who had it off ships from Italy and Bengal, and that the whole art of the place was not to make the silk, for God and the worm had made it, but to take that raw filament, weak and gummy and easily broken, and to wind it and clean it and twist it, 2 or 3 or 4 threads together, hard and even, into a yarn strong enough and true enough that a weaver could set it in his loom and make it into ribbon and figured silk and gauze without it snapping every 3rd pass. Organzine, he said, that was the warp yarn, the hardest and the best, twisted one way and then doubled and twisted the other, and that was the thread that had made the mill's name, and that was the thread they would make again if she had the patience, and she would need the patience, for there was no shortcut in it, and any fool with money could throw a coarse tram yarn, but it took a right hand and a true eye and 40 years of care to throw organzine that the London houses would trust. He taught her the skein and the bobbin and the reel, taught her that the raw silk came wound in great loose hanks that must first be sorted and picked over for the coarse threads and the knots, then soaked and softened, then wound off the skein onto bobbins by the winding engine, then, and only then, thrown, which was the twisting, taught her that a thread thrown too little was weak, and a thread thrown too much was harsh and dead, and that all the art lay in the exact right amount, which no book could give you and no words could teach, but only the hand learning it over years, the fingers coming to know by feel when the twist was true, and he made her run raw thread between her own finger and thumb 100 times, 1,000, until she could feel the difference between a thread thrown a little slack and a thread thrown just right. And at first she could feel nothing at all and thought she never would, and then one gray afternoon she felt it, felt the thread come alive true between her fingers, and she cried out, and the old man grinned all across his beard and said, "There, there, now you have felt it, once you will feel it always, and now you are begun." She listened, and she asked questions until the old man's eyebrows climbed his forehead, and she carried a candle up to the counting-house at night, and read, by its light, the pattern book that had been left to her along with the mill. The pattern book. She had thought at first that it was a book of designs, and in part it was, for the last pages held pinned scraps of woven silk, sample after sample, ribbons and brocades, and a scrap of watered tabby the color of a storm cloud, each with a note beside it in a small cramped hand. But most of the book was something else, and it took her many nights to understand what she held. It was Josiah Quill's whole life of knowing, set down against the day he should be gone. Here was the exact number of turns to give the spindle for each weight of thread. Here the recipe for the soap and water bath that softened the gum without rotting the fiber. Here a table, drawn in faded ink. of how the thread behaved in damp weather and dry, and how to allow for it. Here, most strange of all, in the very back, were pages that had nothing to do with throwing at all. Pages of dyes, of how to get a true crimson out of cochineal, and a fast black without rotting the silk, and, on one page all by itself, ringed round twice in ink, as though the dead man had wanted her eye to fall on it, the receipt for a color he called simply Nunheith blue. A deep clear blue like the sky an hour after sunset, got, the note said, from woad steeped a particular way, and struck with a mordant he had spent 11 years perfecting, and never told to a living soul, and the note beneath it in the same cramped hand, read, "This blue is worth more than the mill. Do not sell the receipt. Make the blue." Marianne read that page a dozen times by candlelight, and did not understand it, and folded down the corner and went on. The pattern book became, in those first months, her nightly companion and her whole education, and she came to feel that she was being taught by a dead man, that Josiah Quill sat with her at the counting-house table in the small hours and passed her, page by careful page, the whole of what 60 years had taught him, and that he had known, writing it, that he would be dead before it was read, and had written it anyway, patiently, for a pair of hands he could only hope would come. She kept a candle end going many a night longer than she could afford, reading it, and she came to know his hand as well as her own, to know when he wrote tired and when he wrote well pleased, and she felt absurdly that she knew this man she had met only as a child, knew him better than she had known anyone but her own father, and that she owed him a debt she could only pay forward, by learning what he taught, and one day teaching it on in her turn, into her own dark, on the same faith that someone would come who needed it. It would be a year and more before she understood it. There were other pages that puzzled her and stayed with her. A page where the dead man had written, not of silk at all, but of himself, a few lines only, dated the winter before he died, that said, "I have thrown silk 60 years, and never married, and never had a child, and the mill is my child, and I am afraid, and I do not know to whom to leave a child," and beneath it, added later in a shakier hand, "Edmund's girl. She has the look of him. She held the pots. I will leave it to Edmund's girl and pray." And Marianne, reading that by candlelight, understood for the first time that she had not been chosen at random or from mere friendship with her father, that the old man had lain awake in this very building fearing for the thing he loved and had settled on her. A child he had watched hold the pots while he grafted, as the one pair of hands he could trust it to, and the weight of that trust came down on her in the dark counting house and frightened her and steadied her at once. For a trust like that is a terrible thing and a strengthening thing, and she resolved again, more solemnly than before, that she would not fail the dead man who had lain awake afraid for want of her. She had need in those first months of understanding things far more ordinary and far more urgent, and the most urgent of all was money. £30 sounds a fortune to a girl who has never had 30 shillings of her own, and it is nothing at all against a dead mill. The wheel alone, Ephraim Sedge told her, would cost near half of it to set right, new buckets turned and fitted, the axle gudgeon rebushed, the great gear picked over tooth by tooth, and the broken cogs cut new. And that was before a single frame was cleaned, before a skein of raw silk was bought, before there was any thread to sell or any coin coming in. She sat down one evening with the pattern book's blank back leaves and a stub of pencil, and did the sums, and did them again, and saw plainly that she could set the wheel turning Or she could buy silk to throw, but she could not do both, and that either alone was useless. A turning wheel with no silk was a millstone grinding air. Silk with no wheel to power the frames could only be thrown by hand, slow as sin, a few ounces a week, when the London houses bought by the hundredweight. She was beaten before she had begun, on paper. And on paper she stayed beaten for 3 days, and on the 4th she took a decision that Ephraim Sedge argued against, and that she made anyway, which was that they would not mend the great wheel that year at all. They would leave it dead. Instead, they would clean and free one single frame, the smallest and the best preserved, and rig it to be turned by hand by a treadle and a handle, and they would throw, slowly, by main strength, a small quantity of the very finest organzine, the best thread the old man's 40 years could produce, and they would take that little and sell it dear to one good house. And with the money from that they would mend one more frame, and then rig the wheel and grow the thing the way a gardener grows a slip from a cutting, and not try to raise the whole dead forest in a season. It is slow, said Ephraim Sedge. It is desperate slow. A hand-turned frame. My grandfather worked so, before there was a wheel here. It is going back 60 years. It is what I can afford, she said, and it lets us begin now, this month, and not next year. Slow and turning beats fast and dead. He looked at her a long while, and then he laughed, the first laugh she had heard from him, a rusty sound. Your father, he said, is that where you got it? All right, Miss Ashcombe. Slow and turning. We'll go back 60 years, you and I, and we'll show them what 40 years of hands can still do with one frame and a girl who won't be told. There was more to it even than she had said, and she came to understand the rest of it in the doing. For the times themselves were against them, and it was not only her own poverty she had to fight, but the poverty of the whole country. It was the 2nd year after the Great War had ended, and the peace that everyone had prayed for had come like a cold drought, throwing the soldiers home to find no work, glutting the market with cheap goods, dropping the price of corn, so that the farmers who had grown rich in the war years now went to the wall. And the poor rates rose, and the workhouses filled, and there was a sullen, hungry anger over the whole West that broke out here and there into rick burnings and machine breaking and men marching. The silk trade had suffered worst of all in the war, when the seas were closed and the raw silk could scarcely be got, and it had not yet recovered, and half the small throwing mills of the West had shut for good. And the wisdom of every sensible man in the 3 valleys was that silk was a dying trade, and that a girl who poured her strength into a dead silk mill in such a year was pouring water into sand. Marianne heard this wisdom from every quarter, from the grocer who sold her candles, from the ostler at the inn, once even from kind old Hannah Pring, who said, not unkindly, over her basket of eggs, that her heart went out to the young lady, but that silk was gone the way of the pillion and the pack-horse, and that no one wore it now who could get the new cheap cottons, and that the young lady would break her heart against it. And Marianne thanked her for the eggs and did not argue, for she had learned already that arguing with the valley's wisdom only fed it. But she thought, privately, that Hannah Pring was both right and wrong. Right that common silk was a dying trade against the cottons, but wrong, she was nearly sure, about the fine silk, the best silk, the silk the great houses and the great ladies wanted and would always want and could not get from a cotton mill however cheap, and that if she could not make common silk cheap, which she could not, then she must make fine silk that no one else could make, which perhaps with the dead man's book she could, and this thought, half-formed and unproven, was the seed of everything, though she did not yet know how much would grow from it. And so they began, and the beginning was hard past anything Marianne had imagined. To clean one throwing frame of 4 years of rust and grease and mouse dirt, to free every one of its 100 small moving parts without breaking the fine old iron, to card out the perished leather and cut and fit new, to true the spindles so they ran without wobble, was 6 weeks of work for the two of them. And Marianne did half of it with her own hands, kneeling on the cold stone in a canvas apron with her sleeves pinned back and her knuckles skinned and black to the wrist, while Ephraim Sedge showed her, part by part, what each piece did and why it must run true. She learned the frame as a surgeon's daughter might, from the bones outward, and by the end of the 6 weeks she knew that one machine better than she knew her own hands, and could name every part of it, and mend it in the dark. There is a thing that happens to a person who takes a great, tangled, ruined machine and, part by patient part, makes it whole again, that no one who has not done it can quite be told, and it happened to Marianne over those 6 weeks, which is that the machine stopped being a wall of frightening iron between her and the trade and became, instead, a thing she understood, and a thing she had made her own by mending. And with that understanding came a confidence that spread out from the frame into the whole rest of her undertaking. For she reasoned, rightly, that if she could learn this, which had looked at first as far beyond her as the moon, then she could learn the next thing too, and the thing after, and that there was nothing in the whole trade that was truly beyond a person willing to sit down before it and learn it part by part, and not be frightened off by how much there was to know. And that, more than any single skill, was what the old foreman gave her in those 6 weeks, not the naming of 100 parts, but the settled, unshakable knowledge that she could learn whatever she needed to learn, which is the only thing a person really needs to begin a great work, all the rest being only time and stubbornness. They lit the counting-house fire against the autumn damp and worked till the light failed, and then worked on by lantern, and the village, which had watched at first for the joke of it, began, some of it, to watch for another reason. An old woman named Hannah Pring, who had wound silk in that mill as a girl and now kept hens at the top of the lane, took to walking down of an afternoon with a basket and leaving eggs on the sill and saying nothing and going away again. A carter named Job Whistler, who had a slack day, appeared one morning and mended the hanging gate and greased its hinge and would take no money, and only said, "My mother wound here, miss," and went off whistling, which was perhaps why they called him so. There were others. A widow named Sarah Cool, who had 4 children and a husband dead of the winter fever and not enough work to keep them, walked down one morning and asked, with her chin up and her eyes frightened, whether there was any winding work to be had, for she had wound silk as a girl and had heard the mill was starting. And Marianne, who could barely feed herself and had no earthly business taking on a hand, looked at the woman's chapped hands and the child on her hip and heard herself say that yes, there would be winding work by and by, and that in the meantime, if Sarah Cool cared to come and learn the new frame's ways against the day, she would find a warm fire and a dinner shared. And it was a rash promise, and it cost Marianne dear that winter in bread she could not spare, but Sarah Cool became her first hand, and her most loyal, and wound silk in that mill for 30 years after, and told her grandchildren that the young mistress had taken her on when she had nothing at all, and shared her own dinner. And there is no wage on earth buys the kind of loyalty a shared dinner buys in a hungry year. These were small things, and Marianne could not have told anyone why they steadied her as they did. But they did. Not the whole valley laughed. The days fell into a shape. She rose before light, for there was no one to rouse her but the cold and the owl coming home, and she lit the counting-house fire, and ate her bread and her eggs standing at the window, watching the valley come gray out of the dark. And then she crossed to the ground floor and worked at the frame, until Ephraim Sedge came down the lane from his cottage with his slow, heavy tread, and they worked together through the short day. And when the light failed, they lit the lantern and worked on. And when at last the old man went home to his supper, she climbed to the counting-house and did her sums and read her book and mended her own clothes and fell into the borrowed cot too tired most nights to be lonely. It was the hardest work she had ever done and the happiest she had ever been, and she puzzled at this often, that a life so cold and poor and laughed at should sit so lightly on her, when the warm, respectable life at her aunt's had lain on her like a wet blanket, and she came in the end to think that it was the ownership of it, that a hard thing that is yours is easier to bear than a soft thing that is another's, and that a person will suffer a great deal to be the author of their own days. And there was one who neither laughed nor helped, but simply came, and stood, and looked, and that was the master of the great house at Nunheith, whose land ran down to the far bank of the river opposite the mill, and whose name was Mr. Gabriel Wyford. He was a man of 32, lately come into the estate on the death of his father, dark-haired and grave and a little stiff in his manner, more used to books and drainage plans than to company, and he had been told by his steward and by Roland Quill, whom he knew a little, that the old Quill mill across the water had been left to some penniless girl who had run off from her family to play at being a manufacturer, and that it was a scandal and an eyesore, and that Mr. Wyford should have nothing to do with it. Mr. Wyford, who was a fair-minded man and disliked being told what to think, walked down to the river-bank one gray afternoon to see this eyesore for himself, and saw instead, through the broken windows of the ground floor, by lantern light, a young woman on her knees in an apron, black to the elbow, working with a file at the innards of a great iron frame, while an old man held a light and named the parts to her, and he saw her look up and answer the old man, and laugh at something, tired and filthy and entirely absorbed, and he stood on his own bank in the dusk and watched for a long time, and went home thoughtful and said nothing to his steward at all. He came again after that, more than once, always to his own side of the water, always at dusk, a solitary dark figure by the river that Marianne, absorbed in her frame, never once noticed, and he could not himself have said, had anyone asked him, why the sight of a poor young woman mending a machine by lantern light should hold a man of his estate on a cold river-bank of an evening, when his own good fire was lit, and his own good supper waiting. He was not a man given to fancies. He was a careful, dutiful, rather lonely man who had come young into a large responsibility and carried it seriously, who read agricultural pamphlets for pleasure, and knew the name of every tenant and the state of every field, and who had grown up watching his father, a kind but idle man, let the estate and the valley slide gently downhill through inattention, while better men grew rich at its expense, and had resolved, when the weight came to him, to be different, to be present, to let nothing good in his valley die for want of his notice. And here across his own river was something good, plainly good, a dead thing coming back to life through sheer stubborn courage, and it drew his careful notice as a lamp draws a moth in the dark, and he watched it and thought about it, and did not yet understand that what he was watching was not only a mill. The first silk they threw came off the hand-turned frame on a raw December morning, 6 weeks before Marianne's money would have run out entirely, and it was, Ephraim Sedge said, turning the small hank of honey-colored thread in the window light. Not bad. Not bad at all, for a first go, and I'll not flatter you, it's not our best. The twist wanders where you tired at the treadle, But it's true enough and even enough that no weaver would send it back. And there's the thing, miss. There's the whole thing. We've thrown silk in this mill again after 4 years, and it will sell. The treadling itself had near broken them both. To turn a throwing frame by hand that had been built to be turned by a river is brutal work, and they took it in turns, an hour each, one treadling while the other fed and watched the thread, and Marianne's legs by the end of a day trembled under her like a colt's, and her hands blistered and then hardened. And Ephraim Sedge, who was 60, would not spare himself though she begged him to. And once she found him gray-faced and gasping on his stool and made him stop and would not let him at the treadle again for 2 days, and he was cross about it and she did not care. But they made the thread. Ounce by slow ounce, over those weeks of December, in the cold and the failing light, treadling by turns and feeding the thread by turns and watching the twist go true or go wandering and doing over what went wrong, they made a little heap of thrown organzine, honey-colored and fine. And it was the hardest won few ounces of silk, Marianne thought, that had ever been made in England, and she was prouder of it than she would ever again be of the great smooth hundredweights the wheel would one day throw in a morning without a hand laid on it. It was a few ounces. It had taken them the better part of 2 weeks of treadling to make. And Marianne held it in her 2 hands as though it were the crown jewels, because in a way it was proof. It was the first thread of the whole cloth of her new life, and she said, very steadily so that her voice should not shake, "Then we had better find a weaver to sell it to, Mr. Sedge, and see if the London houses remember Nunheith." Finding the weaver was Marianne's part, and it was the part Ephraim Sedge could not do, for he was a working man who had never in his life ridden further than Bristol and did not know how to talk to a mercer, whereas Marianne, though penniless, had been raised a gentleman's daughter and knew, at least, how a letter should be written and how a person should carry themselves in a fine shop. She spent 3 evenings composing a letter, and she did not write it to a weaver at all, but to the very top, to the house of Vane and Loder, silk mercers of Cheapside, London, the greatest of the figured silk houses, whose mercery her own father had once, in a story she half remembered, called the finest in the kingdom. She wrote plainly. She said that she was the owner of the silk mill at Nunheith, that the mill had thrown organzine of the first quality for the London trade within living memory, that it was throwing again, that she had a small quantity of new organzine of which she was not ashamed, and that she would be glad to send a sample for their judgment, and that if it did not please them she would take no more of their time. She did not mention that she was a woman of 23 living alone in a ruin, and she signed the letter M. Ashcombe, proprietor. She had signed it so, M. Ashcombe, and let the great house believe her a man, not from any wish to deceive, but from a cold, clear reckoning that a house of trade in London that would read a business letter from Mr. Ashcombe with an open mind would toss into the fire, unread past the signature, the same letter from Miss Ashcombe. And she was not too proud to use the world's foolishness against itself where it served her, and she thought her father, who had once dressed a powder monkey in a midshipman's coat to fool a Spanish lookout, would have approved. It cost her something, all the same, to hide her own name, and she promised herself that one day, when the mill was made and safe, she would sign her whole name to everything, Marianne Ashcombe, and let any man who did not like a woman in trade take his custom elsewhere and be hanged. And she kept that promise, in time. And she wrapped a length of the honey-colored thread in clean paper and sent it up to London on the mail coach. And then she waited, and told no one but Ephraim Sedge that she had done it, for she could not have borne the valley's laughter if nothing came of it. The waiting was its own trial. The 3 weeks it took for a letter to go to London and an answer to come back were the longest of her life to that point, and every day she walked up to the village at the hour the mail came and stood a little apart while the letters were given out. And every day there was nothing for her, and she walked back down the beach lane, trying not to let the emptiness of her hands weigh on her heart, and telling herself that no news was only no news and not yet bad news, and doing her sums over in her head and finding, always, that her money would not last past the middle of February, and that if the London house did not want her silk, she did not know what she should do, for there was no other London house grand enough to pay what she needed, and no local weaver rich enough, and the whole slender tower of her hope stood on one letter to one house, and she knew it was folly to have staked all on one throw, and knew equally that she had had no other throw to make. Something came of it. 3 weeks later, a letter came back, and it was short, and it was from a Mr. Aldous Loder himself, junior partner of the house, and it said that the sample was of good color and better twist than the writer had expected from a mill so long silent, that the house had a use for organzine of that quality, and had been ill served of late by the Coventry throsters, that they would take all Mr. Ashcombe could send them at 24 shillings the pound for the present, more if the quality held, and that a Mr. Loder would himself be travelling into the West in the spring and would call at the mill to see it worked, and that he trusted Mr. Ashcombe would forgive a plain question from a plain house of trade, but was the mill able to supply in quantity, or was this a sample and no more? For the house had no use for a mill that could send a pound this year and nothing the next. It came on a Tuesday, the letter, given into her hand by the boy from the inn who had run down with it, because he knew, the whole village knew by then, that the young lady at the mill was waiting on a letter from London, and she took it with a steady hand and thanked the boy and gave him a penny she could not spare, and waited until he had gone back up the lane before she broke the seal, for she would not be watched reading it, whichever way it fell. That letter Marianne read standing up in the yard, and she had to lean on the gatepost after, and Ephraim Sedge, seeing her face, thought for one dreadful moment it was bad news, until she looked up at him with her eyes bright and said, 24 shillings the pound, Mr. Sedge, and they want all we can make, and the great man himself is coming in the spring to see us work. And the old foreman took off his hat and held it to his chest and said nothing at all for a moment. And then he said, "Well, well now." And that was the second beginning, and it was a better one than the first. For now there was a road ahead of them and a house at the end of it, and all they had to do was walk it. Which is to say, all they had to do was the impossible, for the letter had asked the one question they could not yet answer. Could they supply in quantity? One hand-turned frame could not. One hand-turned frame could send Vane and Loder a pound in 3 weeks and beggar them both in the doing of it. If the great house was coming in the spring, and if it wanted silk in quantity, then the wheel must turn by spring, and the wheel turning meant money they did not have, for the 24 shillings a pound from their first small sale, when it came, would not near cover the mending of the wheel, and there was the trap closing again, the same trap as before, that everything wanted money, and the only thing that made money was the everything. Marianne sat up 2 nights over the figures and saw no way through them that did not begin with borrowing. And she did not want to borrow, for she had grown up in a house where a surgeon's small debts had shadowed every meal, and she knew what a debt was and what it did to a person, and she had promised herself she would build the mill up clean, penny by earned penny, and owe no man. But you cannot always build a thing clean, and she knew that too, and in the end she did the sum a last time and put down the pencil and said aloud to the empty counting-house, "I must borrow, or I must fail, and I did not come here to fail. She spoke of it to Ephraim Sedge, who did not like it, for he was of a generation and a class that held a debt to be a kind of slavery, and would sooner have gone hungry than owed, and he said so. And she heard him out, for she respected him more than anyone living, and then she said, Mr. Sedge, you are right, and I know you are right, and if this were my own belly I should starve before I borrowed a shilling. But it is not my own belly, it is the mill, and the mill can pay a debt back where a belly cannot. For a belly only eats and a mill makes, and a debt laid out to make a thing that then pays the debt is not the same as a debt laid out to eat, and I think even a careful man may borrow to build what he could never borrow to spend. And the old man chewed on that a while, and said at last that he could not fault the reasoning, but that he did not have to like it. And she said she did not like it either. And they left it there, and she went to put on her good gown. She meant to borrow honestly from a bank in Frome on the security of the mill and her signed order from a London house, which was a sound business proposition and would have been granted, and she got as far as putting on her one good gown to ride into Frome and ask for it. And it was on the very morning she meant to ride in that Roland Quill sprang his trap, for he had watchers in the village who told him everything, and he had heard of the London letter, and he knew that if she once got a clean bank loan against a real London order, she would be beyond his reach forever, and so he moved first. He came to the mill that morning, not in his good coat and his reasonable voice, but with a lawyer's clerk beside him, and a paper in his hand, and he stood in the yard and told her, with a small tight smile, that he was sorry to be the bearer of unwelcome news, but that the property she believed she owned free and clear stood, charged with a mortgage of £200 upon the water rights and the wheel race, taken out by his late cousin and never discharged, that he, Roland Quill, was now the holder of that mortgage, having purchased it in the ordinary way of business, that the interest upon it was 2 years in arrears, and that he was, with regret, obliged to call it in. She had, he said, 30 days to pay him £200 and the arrears of interest, being in all £228, or the water rights and the wheel race would be forfeit to him. And a mill whose owner did not own the water that turned its wheel, why, that was no mill at all, that was a stone barn on a river, and he would then be happy, as he had said before, to take the whole off her hands for the price of the timber. He handed her the paper. He was enjoying himself, and he did not trouble to hide it. £228, Miss Ashcombe, he said, in 30 days. Or the water stops. I do not think your London gentlemen will send their great man west to see a wheel that cannot turn. I am sorry. Blood is blood, but business is business. Good day to you. And he touched his hat and got into his gig and drove off, and left her standing in the yard with the paper in her hand and the river running past behind her, indifferent, the very water he had just told her she did not own. Marianne did not weep, and she did not run after him. She stood in the yard a long while until the shaking passed, and then she went in and found Ephraim Sedge and put the paper in his hands, and the old man read it slowly, moving his lips, and his face went gray, and he sat down heavily on a crate and said, God forgive me, miss, I never knew. Mr. Josiah never spoke of it. £200. There is no £200 in the world for us. I am sorry. I am so sorry. I have brought you to this. You have brought me to nothing, she said, and she was surprised to find her own voice steady. He brought me to this, and my own trust brought me here, for I never asked the attorney was the ground clear, and I should have. Well, we have 30 days. Let us not spend the first of them grieving. And she sat down across from the old man in the cold counting-house and made herself think coldly, the way her father in his stories had thought when the odds were against him, not what has gone wrong, but what is still in my hand. What was still in her hand was little enough. 30 pounds nearly spent. One frame, thrown by hand. A signed order from a London house, but for a small first quantity only, not for 200 pounds worth. A pattern book. A dead man's 40 years of knowing in her head and the old foreman's. And the mill itself, which Roland Quill wanted badly enough to have laid a 2-year plan to steal, which meant, she realized slowly, turning the fact over, that the mill was worth stealing, that Roland Quill, who was no fool about money, whatever else he was, had judged it worth 200 pounds of his own coin and 2 years of his patience to get. And a thing a clever, greedy man wants that badly is not a thing worth only its timber. He had lied when he said the timber's price was all it would fetch. He had lied because he wanted it cheap. She thought, too, of a thing her father had told her, that in any fight the great question is never how strong the enemy is, but what the enemy wants. For a man who wants a thing has given you the map of him, and shown you the door he will come through, and if you know what he wants you, are never wholly at his mercy however strong he is, because you can always cost him the thing he wants. She had seen it in his face, that first day in the yard, when he offered her 60 pounds for a wreck he had called worthless, that a man does not offer 60 pounds for a thing worth nothing. And she had filed the contradiction away, and it came back to her now with all its force. Roland Quill wanted the mill whole, and improved and working, not a heap of timber. That was why he had waited, why he had let her labor a year to raise its worth before he struck. And that meant he did not want to strike too hard too soon, did not want truly to break the thing, only to frighten her off it and take it whole, and it meant there was a little room in the trap, a little slack she might work in, if she kept her head and did not give him the panic he was fishing for. That steadied her more than anything, the cold understanding that her enemy's contempt was a performance, and that behind it he valued the very thing he sneered at. If Roland Quill thought the mill worth 200 pounds, then somewhere there were 200 pounds to be had against it, if only she could reach them before his 30 days ran out. But no bank would lend against a property under a called mortgage, that she learned within the week, riding to Frome after all, to the bank she had meant to charm, and being told, kindly and finely, by a Mr. Petheridge in a black coat, that while the house had every respect for her enterprise, they could not advance money upon water rights that were, as he understood it, presently in dispute, and under a notice to forfeit, and that she must clear the mortgage before they could consider a loan, which was, of course, the one thing she needed the loan to do. The trap again. The same trap. A ring of iron with her inside it. She rode home in the rain, and did not weep on the road, because she would not, and got down at the mill soaked to the skin, and found, sheltering in the gateway out of the wet, holding his horse, the master of the great house across the river, Mr. Gabriel Wyford, whom she had never yet spoken to, and who took off his hat to her in the rain and said, "Miss Ashcombe, I think. Forgive the intrusion. I have wanted to make your acquaintance this month past and lacked the excuse, and now I have one, if you will hear it." She was cold and wet and beaten and in no humor for a strange gentleman's excuses, and she nearly sent him away, and something in his face, which was grave and uncertain and not at all the face of a man come to laugh, made her instead say, "Come in out of the wet, sir," such as the shelter is, and she led him into the cold ground floor among the silent frames, and Ephraim Sedge, appearing from the back and seeing the master of Nunheith standing among the spindles, went very still and touched his forehead, and said, "Mr. Wyford, sir, in a voice of some astonishment. Mr. Wyford came to the point in a way that surprised her, being a shy man forcing himself. "Miss Ashcombe," he said, "I will not waste your time with pretty speeches, for I can see you are cold and I dare say you have had a hard day. I have watched this mill come back to life these 3 months from my own side of the water, and I have watched you do it. And I do not mind telling you it has been the finest thing I have seen since I came into this place, and the bravest. And this morning my steward, who has it from Roland Quill's own clerk, told me that Quill has called in a hidden mortgage upon your water rights and means to take the mill by it inside the month. And I confess I have thought of nothing else all day, and I have come, awkwardly and perhaps improperly, to ask whether it is true, and if it is true, whether you will let me be of use." She looked at him for a long moment across the cold frame between them. "Why?" she said at last. "Why should it be anything to you, sir? We have never spoken. You owe me nothing." "I owe the sight of a thing done well more than I can easily say," he said, and colored and pressed on. "And because Roland Quill dined at my table not a fortnight past, and spoke of you in a way that I did not like, and called you a foolish girl playing at trade, and I said nothing at the time, being a coward in my own dining room, and I have been ashamed of my silence ever since, and I find I would rather be of use to you than agreeable to him. And because," he said, more quietly, "my father let a great deal in this valley fall to men like Quill while he sat over his books, and I do not mean to. That is the whole of my reason, and it does me little credit, but it is true." Marianne was silent. Ephraim Sedge, by the wall, had the sense to study his boots. "And what," said Marianne carefully, "do you propose, sir? For I will tell you plainly, I have no fortune. And if you mean to lend me £200, you had as well know the mill cannot promise to repay it soon, and I will not take money I cannot see my way to returning, not even to spite Roland Quill. I do not propose to lend you £200, said Mr. Wyford, and Marianne felt something in her go cold and disappointed, and was angry at herself for having hoped. I propose, he said, something you may like less, but which is honest. The mortgage is upon the water rights and the wheel race. The wheel race, Miss Ashcombe, the leat that carries the water to your wheel, was cut across the corner of my own land 200 years ago, and the right to it, the easement, is a matter of old deeds, and I have spent this last week with my own attorney going through my father's papers, and I believe, I do not yet know, but I believe, that the original grant of that water right was made to the mill by my family in the reign of Queen Anne, upon a yearly rent of 1 peppercorn and a condition. And the condition, if I read the old deed right, is that the water right returns to my estate if ever the mill stands idle above 3 years together. The mill has stood idle 4. Marianne stared at him. Then, she said slowly, the water right is not Josiah Quill's to have mortgaged at all. It reverted to you a year ago, when the mill had stood idle 3 years. It may have done, said Mr. Wyford. My attorney is not yet certain, and Quill's attorney will fight it, and these things can run for years in Chancery, and I would not raise your hopes on a lawsuit, for lawsuits are the death of hope. But there is a plainer road, and it is this. If the water right is mine, then Quill's mortgage upon it is worth nothing. A mortgage upon a thing the mortgager did not own, and he has been robbed by his own greed, for he bought a right that had already come home to me. And if the water right is mine, then I may grant it afresh, to whom I please, upon what terms I please, and I would grant it freely, for the peppercorn and no more, and for as long as the mill is worked, to you. She sat down on the crate, because her knees had stopped being reliable. "Say that again," she said. Mr. Wyford said it again, plainly, and added, "I will be honest to the last of it, Miss Ashcombe, for I would not have you think me nobler than I am. It is not pure charity. If your mill lives, my valley lives. There is work in it for 40 hands who now walk to Thorne's wool mill and hate it. And a working silk mill on my river is worth more to my estate and my tenants than a ruin Roland Quill would strip for timber. So I have my own interest, and you may take my help the more easily for knowing it is not all kindness. But it is some kindness. I will not pretend it is none." She did not take his help all at once, and to her credit and his, it was not settled that gray wet afternoon by any single generous speech. She made him prove it. She made him bring his attorney to the mill and lay the matter out to her plainly and answer her questions, for she had learned already, hard, what came of trusting to a document she had not read, and she would not now leap from Roland Quill's trap into any other man's rope, however kindly held. And Mr. Wyford, far from being offended at being cross-questioned in a cold mill by a woman half his fortune, was delighted by it, and said so, and said that he had never in his life had his charity so thoroughly audited, and that it did her great credit, and did the charity no harm at all to be looked at in a good light, and the two of them bent over the old deeds together at the potting bench by lantern light, her head and his clothes over the brown crackling parchment, working out the sense of the antique clauses word by word, and it was, though neither of them would have named it so, the pleasantest evening either of them had spent in years. It took, in the end, 4 months and not 30 days, and it took the water right deed of Queen Anne's reign found at last in a japanned box in Mr. Wyford's muniment room, brown and cracked and perfectly legible, with the peppercorn rent and the 3 years' idle condition written out in a clerk's fair hand 100 years dead. And it took Mr. Wyford's grave attorney and a barrister up from Bristol, and 1 bad month, when it seemed Roland Quill's lawyers might drag it into chancery after all, and ruin them both with costs. Through that bad month Marianne did not stop the work of the mill for an hour, though her mind was half the time on the lawyers, for she had reasoned that if she lost, the work would have been wasted anyway, and if she won, she would need every ounce of thread she could throw against the London order, and that in neither case did stopping help her. And so she threw silk by hand through the whole anxious spring, while grave men in Bristol argued over 100-year-old peppercorn, and there was a kind of courage in that daily plodding on through uncertainty that was greater, she came to think, than any single brave deed. For anyone can be brave for a moment, but to get up every cold morning and treadle a frame while your whole fate hangs, unknown on other men's arguments, is a slow, brave thing that no one sees and no one praises. And it is the kind of courage that actually builds the world. But Quill's case was rotten at the root, for he had indeed bought a mortgage upon a right his cousin had lost a year before. And when the barrister laid the old deed before him, and his own attorney read it, and went pale, Roland Quill did the sum in his head, the sum of what a chancery suit would cost him against a right he could not win, and he folded. He folded uglily, with threats and a letter full of the word ruin. But he folded, and he sold the worthless mortgage back for what he had paid for it, glad to cut his loss. And he left the valley that summer for Bristol and a place in a counting house. And Marianne never saw him again, though she heard of him now and then, growing smaller in the distance, a clerk. Then a clerk dismissed for sharp practice. Then nothing. His fate was not dramatic. He simply dwindled, as such men do, out of the story of better people. And the water right was granted fresh to Marianne Ashcombe, proprietor, for 1 peppercorn a year and as long as the mill should be worked. And Mr. Gabriel Wyford brought the sealed deed to the mill himself, and put it in her hands in the yard on a bright March morning, and would take nothing for it, and she paid her first year's rent on the spot, gravely, with a single dried peppercorn she had bought from the grocer in the village for a farthing, and pressed it into his palm, and they both at last laughed. "That is your rent paid," he said, closing his hand on it. "The mill is yours, water and all, and no man can take it from you now while it turns." "Then it had better keep turning," she said. And it did. With the mortgage lifted and a real London order in her strong box and the water right secure, the Frome Bank found its courage, and Mr. Petheridge in his black coat advanced her, at last, the money to mend the great wheel, against the mill and the order both. And in the late spring of that year the wheel of Nunheath Mill turned for the first time in 4 years. They had all come out to see it, Ephraim Sedge and Hannah Pring and Job Whistler and half the village, when the old man drew the pin and let the water into the race, and the water came down the leet brown and eager and struck the new bucketed wheel, and for one long dreadful moment nothing happened at all. The water struck, and the wheel did not stir, and Mary Ann's heart stopped, and Ephraim Sedge muttered a word under his breath that was half a prayer and half a curse, and put his own shoulder to a spoke, and then the wheel groaned and hung and shuddered, and the water filled the top buckets, and their weight came onto it, and it began, slowly, hugely, to turn. And the gear took up inside with a sound like a giant clearing its throat, and along the ground floor the 6 frames, cleaned and freed and set to rights through a winter of labor, began one after another to run, the spindles blurring, the reels filling, 40 years of silence breaking into a great soft roar of turning iron and singing thread, and old Ephraim Sedge stood in the middle of it, with the tears running openly down into his beard, and did not care who saw. And Marian stood beside him with her hand pressed to her mouth, and could not speak at all. It was a sound, she would say long after, that she felt in her chest before she understood it with her ears. A deep, soft thrumming that came up through the stone floor and the soles of her feet, and filled the whole long building the way blood fills a body, and she stood in the middle of it, and felt the mill come alive around her, felt it stop being a building she was fighting to save, and become a living, working thing with its own great, slow heartbeat, and the 6 frames ran, and the thread ran, and the water ran, and the wheel turned, and it was, she thought, the nearest thing to a resurrection she would ever see with her own eyes. A dead thing made to live again by love and labor and 100-year-old peppercorn, and if she had had any breath in her at all she would have prayed, but she had none, and only stood, and let it fill her, while beside her the old man wept, and the village cheered, and the water came down the race, brown and eager, and gave itself, drop by drop, to the turning of the great wheel. Gabriel Wyford was there, at the back of the little crowd, not pushing forward, watching her more than the wheel, and when at last she turned, breathless and shining, and found his eyes across the crowd, he did not smile, quite. But something passed between them over all the cheering heads that neither of them had words for yet, and both of them looked away, and both of them knew, and neither said. Mr. Loder of Vane and Loder came in April, as he had promised, a small, precise Londoner who had expected, he admitted later, to find a folly, and found instead a working throwing shop turning out organzine as fine as any he bought, minded by a foreman of 40 years' skill, and owned by a young woman who could talk to him of twist and denier and the London market as an equal, and who showed him her order book and her costs and her sample cards without a blush, and drove, at the end of it, a harder bargain than he had meant to allow, and got it, because the silk was worth it, and he knew it. There was a moment during that visit that Marianne kept by her ever after. Mr. Loder, going round the frames with his sharp small eyes, had stopped by the smallest one, the first one they had freed, the one they had turned by hand all through that first desperate winter, and he had asked, idly, why that one frame was so much more worn about the treadle than the others, worn bright, worn as no water-driven frame is ever worn. And Ephraim Sedge had opened his mouth to answer, and Marianne had caught his eye, and the old man had shut it again and let her speak. And she had said simply that they had turned that frame by hand for a winter, before the wheel was mended, because it was the only way they could begin. And the small, precise Londoner had stood very still and looked at the bright, worn treadle a long moment. And then he had looked at Marianne, and then at her hands, which bore the marks of that winter still, and would bear them for years, and something in his sharp merchant's face had changed and gone quiet, and he had said, in a different voice from the one he did business in, "Miss Ashcombe, I have bought silk 35 years, from mills all over England and Italy both, and I have never yet bought a pound of it that was thrown by the owner's own hands on a frame turned by the owner's own legs in a winter, when the owner could not afford to fail. I did not know such a thing was still done. I am not sure it has ever been done by a lady." He was quiet a moment more. "I shall not forget it," he said. And he did not, and it was that, as much as the quality of the thread, that made him hers. For a merchant who respects you buys from you in the bad years as well as the good. And there were bad years coming, as there always are, and Vane and Loder stood by the Nunheath mill through all of them. "On the strength," Mr. Loder said once in his cups many years later, "of a bright worn treadle and a pair of ruined hands." He went back to London and told his partner that the Nunheath mill was the best small throwing shop in the West, and that they should tie it to them before Coventry heard of it, and Vane and Loder became Marianne's house, and took all she could make, and the road ahead for the first time ran clear and level as far as she could see. It would be pleasant to end there, on the turning wheel and the London house, and the enemy dwindled, and many a story does. But the truest part of Marianne Ashcombe's story was not the saving of the mill, which after all a run of luck and one good man's help had done as much as her own courage. The truest part was what she did after she was safe, when she might have sat back and grown comfortable and let the mill make her merely respectable, and did not. For she had never forgotten the page in the pattern book, ringed twice in ink, the Nunheath blue, and the dead man's words beneath it. "This blue is worth more than the mill. Do not sell the receipt. Make the blue." And in her second winter, with the mill turning steady and money coming in and a little breathing room at last, she took the pattern book to the one part of the works that still stood cold and dead, the dye house at the mill's end, a low stone room with great lead-lined vats and a copper and a smell of old chemistry sunk into the walls, and she set herself to make the blue. She had reasons beyond the dead man's charge to want the blue, and they were sound business reasons, for she had seen already the shape of the danger that hangs over every mill that only throws thread, which is that thread is a thing anyone with money and skill can make, and that the moment the Coventry throwsters mended their ways or a new mill opened nearer London, Vane and Loder would buy where it was cheapest, as all merchants must, and the 24 shillings the pound would become 22, and then 20, and the mill would be back to scraping, forever at the mercy of a price it did not set. She had lain awake over this. She had seen that to throw good thread was to be respectable, and to be forever poor. That the only silk mill that was ever truly safe was one that made a thing no one else could make, that could name its own price because there was nowhere else to buy. And she had understood, reading the dead man's ringed page by candlelight, that this was exactly what Josiah Quill had been trying to tell her from beyond the grave, that the blue was not a luxury or a whim, but the whole future of the mill, the one wall between her people and the poorhouse when the lean years came, and that when he wrote this blue is worth more than the mill, he had meant it plainly and exactly, and had not been able to say it plainer, because he had run out of years. So she went into the cold dye house, not as a dreamer chasing a dead man's fancy, but as a woman of business securing her house against the storm she could see coming, and that was the difference, in the end, between her and the score of poor dreaming souls who chase a beautiful thing and starve. That Marianne chased a beautiful thing because it was also the sensible thing, and had reasoned her way coldly to the same door her heart was already knocking at. It near broke her. The receipt was written for a man who already knew what he was doing, all its hardest steps taken for granted, and Marianne knew nothing of dying, and had to learn it as she had learned throwing, from the fibrae outward, only with no Ephraim sedge to teach her, for the old man knew frames and not vats. She sent, quietly, for books, and read what little there was, most of it useless or wrong or written in the guarded half-language of men protecting their own secrets, and she learned that dyeing was not one art but three: the preparing of the silk to take the color, the making of the dye itself, and the striking of the color fast so it would not wash or fade, and that the dead man's receipt was strong on the last, the striking, which was where his 11 years' secret lay, but took the first two for granted, so that she must learn from nothing the very ground the whole thing stood on. And she learned it the only way there is, which is by getting it wrong, over and over, all through that second winter, alone in the cold stone dye house at the mill's end, with the great lead-lined vats steaming and the copper bubbling, and her hands stained deeper and deeper until they were blue-black to the wrist and would not come clean for scrubbing, and she gave up trying and went about the valley with dyer's hands like a badge she had not chosen. She spoilt silk. That was the hard part. Harder than the cold or the fumes or the failure, that every batch she spoilt was good thrown silk that had cost her people days of labor and cost her strongbox real money, and she felt every ruined hank as a small betrayal of the hands that had made it, and there were nights she stood over a vat of silk gone the color of dishwater, and had to grip the stone edge of it and breathe slowly and remind herself, aloud, in the empty steaming room, that the dead man had spent 11 years on this, 11 years, and that she had spent not one, and that she had no right yet to despair. She spoilt pound after pound of good thrown silk in that dye house over the winter, boiled it gray, struck it a muddy slate, once a hideous green, and each spoiled hank was money out of the strongbox, and she felt every one. There was one batch that winter that near ended it. She had been 6 weeks at the dyeing and had got, at best, a dull grayish blue that was no good to anyone, when she thought she saw, at last, the trick of the mordant, and struck a whole batch her new way, a good batch, 1.5 pounds of her finest thrown silk, weeks of the mill's work, and she lifted it dripping from the vat, sure this was the blue at last, and it came up the color of a drowned man's lips, a horrible dead lilac gray, ruined past saving. 1.5 pounds of good silk turned to nothing in an afternoon by her own hand, and she stood in the cold dye house holding it, and something in her that had held through the will and the mortgage and the mockery of 3 valleys simply gave way, and she sat down on the wet stone floor with the ruined silk in her lap and put her face in her stained hands and wept as she had not wept since her father died. Wept from the very bottom of her, that she had reached too far, that the dead man's blue was beyond her, that she had wasted the mill's silver chasing a color she had no business thinking she could make, that she was, after all, only a surgeon's orphan playing at a thing that wanted a master's 40 years. And it was into that, the very lowest hour of the whole 7 years, lower than the mortgage, for the mortgage was another man's cruelty, and this was her own failure, that Gabriel Wyford walked. And Mr. Wyford, who came often now, on one errand and another that all amounted to the same errand, found her that evening sitting on the dye-house step, with her hands stained blue-black to the wrist, and a ruined skein in her lap, and her face streaked where she had wiped it. And he sat down beside her on the cold step, without a word, and after a while said, "My father spent 9 years draining the low meadow and never got it right, and I finished it in 2. Not because I was cleverer, but because I had all his failures to start from, and did not repeat them. Have you kept a note of every batch that failed, and what you did?" She had. "Then you are not spoiling silk," he said. "You are buying knowledge, and it is dear, but it is not wasted. And I have never in my life seen anyone I would sooner back to come out the far side of a hard thing." And she looked at him then, really looked, at this grave, shy, careful man who had watched her from across a river and found an old deed to save her, and now sat on a cold step in the dark with a woman stained to the elbows, and talked to her of failures as gifts, and she understood, all at once and rather late, what everyone in the valley had understood for a year, and she did not say anything. But she did not move away from him on the step either, and they sat there in the dark a long while, and that was its own kind of beginning. She had not let herself think of it before. There had been no room in her for it, so filled had she been with the mill, and she had told herself, in the odd moment when the thought pressed at the door, that a man of his estate could have no serious thought of a stained, penniless, silk-thrust or whatever kindness he showed, that to imagine otherwise was the kind of soft folly her aunt would have expected of her, and that she had better keep her mind on her thread. But sitting there on the cold step, with him not moving away either, she let herself, for the first time, think of it, and having thought of it, she could not stop. And she was cross with herself for the flutter it set up in her, for she had a mill to run and no time to be a girl about a man, and yet she was, a little, and she found she did not altogether mind, and that was new. He came often after that, as I have said, and always he came in a way she could not object to, on some errand of business that gave them both a reason, a question about the water, a book he thought might help her with the dyeing, a basket of hothouse fruit from his own glass houses that he said would only spoil else and might as well be eaten, and they both knew the errands were pretexts, and neither of them named it. And it went on so a long time, gently, without a word said. Two careful people circling a thing too precious to rush, and it was, Marianne thought afterward, the sweetest courtship in the world exactly, because neither of them would presume to call it one. And she came to listen for his step on the yard cobbles, and to be glad when it came, and to save up small things through the day to tell him, and to know herself, at last, in love, and to be quietly astonished by it, that this too should have been waiting for her at the end of a ruined road she had walked, because everyone told her not to. She got the blue in the March of her 3rd year. She got it on a gray morning alone in the dye-house, having changed the striking of the mordant by a hair on a hunch the pattern book had not given her, her own knowledge now and not the dead man's, and she lifted the skein from the vat, and it came up wet and dark, and she carried it dripping to the door for the daylight, and as it dried in the air before her eyes it bloomed, It opened. It became a blue like no blue she had ever seen off any thread. A deep, clear, living blue, like the sky an hour after the sun is gone, like the very edge of the night. A blue that seemed lit from within, and she stood in the doorway holding it up against the gray morning, and began quietly to laugh and to cry both at once. And Ephraim Sedge came running at the sound, thinking she was hurt, and found her holding a skein of blue silk up to the light like a woman holding up a lamp. And the old man looked at it and took off his hat, which was the thing he did in the presence of what he thought holy, and said softly, oh, miss, that's it. That's the blue." He got it once, old Josiah. Once, 30 years gone, died one bolt of it that hung in the London mercer's window a fortnight and had half the fine ladies of the town at the door. And then he lost the knack of it and could never strike it true again, try as he might, year on year. And it half broke him, and he swore in the end he would take the secret to his grave. And by God, he near did. That is worth £100 a pound in London, that is, and there is not another mill in England can make it. You have it now. It is yours. That night she did not sleep at all. She sat up in the counting-house with the skein of blue silk on the table before her and a single candle behind it, so that the light came through the thread and the whole skein seemed to glow, to hold light the way a stained glass window holds it, and she looked at it for hours, and thought of the dead man who had got it once, and lost it, and taken his failure to his grave, believing the knack died with him, and thought that she had finished a thing a man had begun before she was born, had reached back across death, and taken the half-made thing out of his cold hands, and finished it, and that this, more than the mill, more than the money, more than anything, was what she had been left the mill to do. And she wept a little, alone, not from sorrow. And then she wrapped the skein carefully in clean paper and slept 2 hours and rose and went back to the dye-house to do it again, and prove it was no accident, and it was not. She got the blue a second time and a third. Her own knowledge now, sure and repeatable. And only when she had done it 3 times running did she let herself believe it was truly hers. She sent a single skein of it to Vane and Loder with no letter but a line, "This is Nunhith blue. Name your price." And Mr. Loder himself came west again within the month. And this time he did not haggle at all, which frightened her more than haggling would have. And he asked, very quietly, whether the color could be had in quantity, and whether the receipt was safe, by which he meant, could anyone else get it? And she said the receipt was in her head, and one locked book, and nowhere else on earth. And he nodded slowly and said that in that case Vane and Loder would take every yard of blue silk she could throw and dye, at a price he then named, and the price was such that Ephraim Sedge, who was standing by, had to sit down. And that was the making of the mill, and the making of Marianne Ashcombe. Not the saving of it, but the blue. The thing she made that no one else could make. The thing she wrung out of a dead man's half-receipt and a winter of ruined skeins and her own stubborn hands. For the blue could not be counterfeited, and every great house and every fine lady in London wanted the blue. And it came from one mill on one river in the west, and from nowhere else, and the mill owners of 3 valleys who had laughed at her, Mr. Barnabas Thorne of the great wool mill first among them, found within 3 years that the penniless girl they had given till Michaelmas was the master of the most spoken of silk in the kingdom, and could not for love or money get the receipt of it. Though more than one tried, and one sent a man to take work at the mill and learn its secrets, and Ephraim Sedge knew him for what he was in a day, and set him to sweeping the yard until he left. She guarded the receipt as a miser guards gold, and better, for she understood that the whole safety of her people rested on it, that so long as the blue could be had from none height and nowhere else, the mill could weather any lean year and keep its 40 hands in bread. And she dyed the blue always alone, with the dye-house door barred, and she wrote the full receipt nowhere but in the one locked book. And she resolved that she would teach it, when the time came, to one trusted pair of hands only, and choose that pair as carefully as Josiah Quill had chosen her. And she did, in the end. But that was many years off. For now she simply kept it, and made it, and it made the mill, and the mill made the valley. For the money the blue brought in did not stop at her strongbox, but ran out through the whole neighborhood in wages and in trade, so that the little shops of the village grew and prospered, and cottages that had stood empty filled again, and young folk who would have walked away to the wool mills and the cotton stayed, and married, and raised children who would throw silk in their turn, and the whole valley, which had been sliding quietly downhill for a generation, turned like the wheel and began to climb. The vindication of Marianne Ashcombe was not a single scene, but a slow turning of the whole valley's weather, and it came to a kind of head one autumn afternoon in her 4th year, when a carriage she did not know drew up in the mended yard, a fine carriage, and out of it came Mr. Barnabas Thorn himself, the great wool master, who had wagered she would not last till Michaelmas, hat in hand, and behind him his wife in her best pelisse, and Mr. Thorn stood in the yard where 4 years before the barrow had lain on its side, and looked at the turning wheel and the busy windows and the 40 hands at work, who had once been his, and he said, awkwardly, for he was not a man used to eating his words, Miss Ashcombe, I will not pretend I do not know we have not been friends. I said things, and wagered things, and I was wrong. And I have come to say so plainly, man to man, for that is the only apology worth making. I did not think a woman could raise a dead mill, and I said so at every dinner in the valley, and I was a fool. And every clothier from here to Bradford knows it now. For there is not one of us has made anything in 10 years that the world wanted the way it wants your blue. My wife would give her eye teeth for a length of it. And I have come, cap in hand, to ask whether you would sell us so much as a single yard, and to say, before that I was wrong, and that you have done a thing none of us could do, and I honor you for it. And Marianne Ashcombe, who was 26 now, and stood straight in a plain good gown of her own making, with her hands unstained for once, looked at the great man in her yard, and she did not smile in triumph, and she did not remind him of the wager, and she did not make him grovel, for she had learned from a dead gardener of thread and a living master of water that the only victory worth having is the quiet kind. She said, I thank you, Mr. Thorn. That was handsomely said, and it cannot have been easy, and I honor you for it in turn. Come in, both of you, out of the wind, and Mrs. Thorn shall see the blue thrown and dyed, and you shall take a length of it home with you as a gift and not a purchase, for I would rather have a neighbor than a customer, and this valley has too few neighbors and too many rivals as it is. And she took them in, and showed them the wheel and the frames and the dye-house, and gave Mrs. Thorn a length of the Nunheath blue with her own stained hands, and made in an afternoon of an enemy a friend, which is a harder and a rarer thing than making of an enemy nothing, and the whole valley heard of it by nightfall, and thought the better of her for it, and that was the true summit of her vindication, not that she beat them, but that when she had beaten them she was kind. Mr. Thorn was not the last to come and eat his words, only the greatest. Through that year and the next they came, one and another, the men who had laughed at the dinner tables, each in his own way and his own time. Mr. Petheridge of the Frome Bank, who had turned her away in her worst hour, came to solicit her account and had the grace to say, over his black coat, that he had been correct by the rules of his trade and wrong by every other measure, and that he had thought of it often since, and was sorry, and she took her account to his bank, for she bore no grudges that cost her money to keep, and he was a careful, honest man who had only done his careful, honest duty, and she would rather have him mind her money than a bolder fool. The grocer who had told her silk was dead now stocked ribbon of her thread and boasted of it. Even her aunt came, in the end, Mrs. Prudence Ashcombe, in her best pelisse, driven over in a hired chaise, and sat very straight in the counting-house that had once been Mary Ann's bare cold cell and was now a snug-panelled office with a good fire, and said, stiffly, working her gloved hands, that she had perhaps spoken hastily, that winter, that she had feared for Mary Ann's good name, that a young woman alone, and so forth, that she saw now she had been anxious rather than unkind, and that she hoped there was no lasting ill feeling. And Mary Ann, who remembered exactly the words her aunt had used, "Go and live in your ruin among the rats and see how you like it," looked at the frightened, proud old woman working her gloves by the fire, and understood that the apology such a person could manage was a small, stiff thing, and that to demand a fuller one would be cruelty. And she rose and kissed her aunt's cheek and said there was no ill feeling in the world, and that she was glad she had come, and gave her tea, and sent her home with a length of the blue and a hamper of good things, and her aunt wept a little in the chaise on the way home, from what mixture of feelings not even she could have said, and told everyone in her parish thereafter that her niece, the silk manufacturer, was the cleverest woman in the West, and had always had it in her, which was not at all what she had said at the time, but which Mary Ann let stand, for it cost nothing to let an old woman rewrite her own small history to live more comfortably in it. He asked her on the dye-house step, which was fitting, for it was where they had first sat in the dark, and he asked her badly, which was also fitting, for he was a shy, grave man, and had rehearsed a speech, and forgot the whole of it the moment her stained hand was in his. He said, "I had meant to say a great many things, and I find I cannot remember one of them, except the last, which is that I have loved you since I saw you on your knees, mending a frame by lantern light with your sleeves pinned back before I knew your name, and that I have been coming here 2 years on false errands because I could not stay away, and that I do not care a straw that you are a manufacturer and stain your hands blue and are talked of in 3 valleys. Or rather, I do care. I care that you are all those things, for it is those things I love you for, and I would not have you be a soft, idle lady for the world. Marry me, and keep your mill, and keep your name over the door if you like, for I would not take it from you, I would only stand beside it." And Mary Ann, who had schooled herself for 2 years not to hope for exactly this, found that all the schooling fell away at once and left her standing on the step with her heart going like the wheel, and she said, when she could speak, that she had one condition, and only one, and that he had better hear it before he committed himself. And he said, gravely alarmed, "Name it." And she said, "That the mill is mine, and shall stay mine, and that I shall run it as I have run it, and answer to no man for it, not even to a husband I love, for I did not save it from Roland Quill to hand it to a kinder master." And Gabriel Wyford looked at her a long moment, and then he laughed, the free, glad laugh of a man whose whole fear has been lifted, and said, "My dearest girl, I should not know how to throw a thread to save my life, and I would not dream of touching your mill. I want a wife, not a manufactory. Keep the mill, and I shall keep the estate, and we shall each mind our own, and meet in the middle, and be the happiest pair in the West." And she said then yes, and it was the only easy yes she had said in 7 hard years. And it was the sweetest. She married Gabriel Wyford in the church at Nunhith in the spring of her 7th year, and it was a quiet wedding by his choice and hers, and the mill closed for the one day only in all its working life, and the 40 Hands and Hannah Pring and Job Whistler and old Ephraim Sedge, who gave the bride away for want of a father to do it, and cried the whole way up the aisle and was not ashamed, all came. And afterward there was no grand breakfast at the great house, but a long trestle. Table set down the middle of the mill's ground floor between the silent frames, and the whole village ate there among the machines that had made it all possible, and the last of the light came in through the mended windows and fell on the honey-colored silk and here and there, on a bolt of the famous blue hung up for the day like a banner. She wore, that day, a gown of her own thread, thrown in her own mill and woven for her by a Coventry weaver who was proud to do it, not the blue, for the blue she thought too grand for a working woman's wedding, but a soft, warm ivory silk that took the spring light and held it. And she carried orange blossom from Gabriel's own glasshouses. And Hannah Pring cried, and Sarah Cool cried, and Job Whistler got quietly and happily drunk and made a speech that no one could follow, and everyone cheered. And the 40 Hands who owed their bread to the turning of that wheel stood along the walls of the mill they worked in, and drank the health of the young mistress who had saved it. And there was not, Marianne thought, looking down the long trestle table at all the faces, one soul in that building who had been made poorer by her, and a good many who had been made whole. And she thought that if a life could be weighed at all, it was weighed like that. Not in what you had gathered to yourself, but in how many were the warmer for your having lived. And by that measure she was already rich past counting, and she had done it all with a ruin and 30 pounds and a dead man's book. And she bowed her head a moment at her own wedding breakfast and gave thanks, silently, to a God she was not always sure of, but was sure of that day, for the strange crooked road that had brought her from her aunt's cold parlor to this warm, loud table in a living mill. Ephraim Sedge lived to see the mill pass its 10th year of turning, and to teach a dozen young throsters the craft he had feared would die with him. He had, in those years, a place in the valley such as no wage could have bought him, for everyone knew that the mill lived because he had waited 4 years to be asked, and then given the last of his strength to the asking. And the young throsters he taught called him grandfather, all of them, though he was kin to none. And he minded the frames until his hands would no longer serve, and then he sat by them in a chair Marianne had made for him, and watched, and named the parts to the young ones as he had once named them to her, and was, she thought, as near to perfectly content as a working man ever comes, having lived to see the thing he loved not only saved but grown past anything he had known in its old great days, and having had a hand in the saving. And he died at last in his own cottage up the lane in the fullness of a good age, with Marianne sitting by him, and his last clear words to her, she told Gabriel after, were, "We did it, though, didn't we, miss? We made her turn again." And she said, "We did, Mr. Sedge." We made her turn, and he smiled and was easy, and slept, and did not wake, and she wound a thread of Nunhith blue about his still hand before they closed the coffin, so that a little of the mill went with him into the ground, for it was more his than anyone's, hers by the will, but his by the 40 years. She had children, in time, 3 of them, and raised them in the great house across the water but never far from the mill, and they grew up half gentry and half throster, at home in a drawing room and at home among the frames. And it was her second child, a quiet, watchful girl named Edmuda for the grandfather Marianne had lost, who showed from small the true feel for the thread, who could tell a good twist from a bad by running it through her fingers as her mother had learned to, and who asked, at 11, the age Ephraim Sedge had come to the mill, whether she might learn the whole of it, and Marianne looked at her grave, watchful daughter and saw herself, and saw Josiah Quill's fear answered down the years, and said yes, and taught her everything. In time, even the blue, barring the dye-house door on the two of them alone, mother and daughter, the day she gave the receipt at last into another pair of hands, and it was the proudest and the most frightening day of her life after the day she got the blue herself, and Edmuda kept it, and made it, and the blue went on. She kept the pattern book on a shelf in the counting house all her life, and she added to it, in her own hand now, the true receipt of the blue as she alone had won it, and her own tables and notes and failures. 40 years of new knowing set down beneath the dead man's old, against the day she in her turn should be gone and another young pair of hands should need to be taught. And on the first page where Josiah Quill had written nothing, she wrote a line of her own, the only line in the whole book that was not a matter of business, and she wrote it for whoever should come after, and it said, "This was left to me when I was worth nothing to anyone, by a man who saw what I might be worth when no one else looked, and everything I have made, I made because he looked. Look at the overlooked ones. There is a blue in them the world has not seen yet." She lived to be very old, and the mill turned all her days and after them, and the blue went out from that one river to the whole world, and made the name of Nunhith known in places its own valley had never heard of, and grand ladies in cities she never saw wore at their throats a blue that a stained and stubborn young woman had wrung out of a ruin and a dead man's book, and never knew whose hands had made it nor cared, and that was as Marianne wished it, for she had never done any of it to be known. She had done it because a thing was worth doing, and because she would not be told she could not, and because once, when she was 23 and worth nothing to anyone, an old foreman had taken off his hat in a leaking loft and said he had prayed to be asked. And if you had asked her, at the very end of her long life, what the whole of it had taught her, she would have said, "I think that the world is full of ruined things that everyone has given up for dead silk mills and gardens and orphaned girls and old men and whole valleys sliding downhill, and that most of them are not dead at all, only waiting, only wanting one pair of hands willing to sit down before them and begin, and that the great sorrow of the world is not that these things cannot be saved, but that so few will trouble to try, being frightened off by how much there is to do, or by what people will say, or by the smallness of their own beginnings." She had begun with a ruin and £30 and a borrowed bonnet, and she had made a life out of it, and a blue the world had never seen, and 40 families kept in bread, and a marriage of true regard, and she had done it not because she was cleverer or stronger or braver than other women, but only because, at the one moment that mattered, standing in a leaking loft with a dead wheel below her, she had not said no. And now I would like to ask you something, before we let the wheel run down for the night. Marianne Ashcombe was left a ruin and £30 and a name the whole valley laughed at, and out of that she made a life, and a blue the world had never seen, and a marriage of true regard, and a home. And she said, at the last, that everything she made because one man looked at her when no one else did, and saw what she might be worth. So here is the question I would leave with you tonight, and it is not a question with a right answer, only your own. When you think back over your own long life, do you find that the thing that turned you, the thing that made you into who you became, was chiefly the one person who believed in you when no one else would, the Josiah Quill, or the Ephraim Sedge, or the Gabriel Wyford who simply looked and saw your worth? Or was it rather the thing you found in yourself, alone, on a cold step with stained hands and a ruined skein in your lap, the stubbornness that would not be told you could not, that mattered most in the end, the one who looked, or the will that would not quit? Sit with that a while tonight and see which of the two your own heart names, for I think every life is made of both, but I think each of us knows, in the quiet, which one saved us. Next week, if you will come back and sit by the fire with us again, I will tell you the story of another young woman, in another hard year, who was left something everyone told her to throw away, a derelict apiary on a windswept heath and 1,000 empty hives, and what she did with it, and the harvest no one thought could come from that bare ground. Wherever you are listening tonight, from whatever quiet corner of whatever country, leave a word below and tell us the name of the one who looked at you when no one else did, so that we may all of us know their names, for a name spoken kindly is never quite gone. And now the light is nearly down the valley, and the water is running slow in the race, and the great wheel is coming to its rest, and the frames are still, and Marianne Ashcombe sits in the doorway of her mill in the last of the evening, with a skein of blue silk cooling in her lap, and the man she loves coming up the path from the great house across the water, and the river runs on, as it always has and always will, past the turning of the wheel, and past the stilling of it, indifferent and eternal and kind, carrying the light of the fallen sun away downstream toward a sea none of them will ever see.